On that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And waking up, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be silent, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. So this morning, Andrew kind of suggested a good place to be with you in your study that you're involved in the next couple of weeks, last week I think too. He said, how about you talk about the idea of rest? And I laughed. I'm a good sport. I laughed, and I didn't tell him this, but I thought to myself, okay, I can do rest, but probably the only thing I'm less qualified to talk to you about this morning would be fasting. I am just not good at rest. And I want to be. We're talking about it. I'm talking about it with our group tonight when Common Table meets, actually right here in this room. Because of your gracious generosity and hospitality, our church will be here this evening, and I will be talking with them about rest. We're going through this series with our group on spiritual practices, and I've encouraged the group in the realm of spiritual practices and things that are recognized as can be identified as spiritual practices. There can be anywhere from like 8 to 20, depending on how they're categorized and how they're broken out. But I've encouraged our group to really kind of focus on maybe the top 3 that they're actually good at and might be successful in practicing and getting better at, and then pick one that you just are terrible at. And that's going to be a challenge, and you're going to commit to working on that one. Well, for me, that would probably be rest. I didn't even include fasting, because fasting is just a lost cause for me. But I did pick rest. And I don't know if you know this or not, but probably one of the biggest obstacles, one of the biggest, I think, pitfalls for people who are in ministry, for pastors, is that they can tend to be workaholics, and they can tend to not have a very good rest ethic. Because if you think about it, when some people talk about the idea of Sabbath, a lot of people identify the idea of Sabbath, they identify with Sunday. And so people will even go, well, okay, I can include church, I can include worship as part of my Sabbath rest day, and I can structure the rest of my Sunday around that. Well, pastors don't get the luxury of that. On Sundays, so for 30 some odd years, when I would be with a congregation speaking 1, 2, sometimes 3 times every morning, and being an introvert, by noon, when we were done, I was done. I kind of had a self-imposed rest. I didn't have a choice because I had nothing left, but it certainly wasn't restful for me. But the other thing about that is, to be a pastor who's a workaholic is like a gold mine for a church. They're not going to tell you that, but churches just love people like me who just are obsessed with ministry and cannot stop doing ministry. Fortunately, I had a partner in my wife who was also just as obsessed with ministry as I was, so it didn't really create marital conflict with us, but it wasn't healthy either. So one of the things that I could tell you as a congregation, one of the best things you can do for Andrew, for your pastor, is to encourage him to rest. And not, if you see signs of workaholic in something like that, you be able to step in and go, okay, you need to tone it down a little bit. No one ever did it for me. They loved the way I did things. but it's certainly not healthy. In fact, when I was researching this and the idea of even pastors and rest, I discovered that back in the frontier days, in the early 1800s in particular, out in particularly the East Coast and the Midwest, there was this thing called circuit rider preachers. I don't know if you're accompanied or if you're acquainted with that idea, but circuit rider preachers, in particular, I was looking at this group of Wesleyan pastors, and they were expected to do 90 to 100-hour weeks, every week, week after week, to the point that there were so many of the Wesleyan circuit rider pastors that were literally collapsing from exhaustion. They established a fund for worn-out pastors. Notice they didn't change their expectations or tactics. They do what we tend to do to a problem to solve it is we don't want to solve it, we'll throw money at it. But so I stand before you, and this is going to be one of those moments, I'm just going to be honest, this is kind of leaning towards do as I say, not as I do, okay? I'm working on it. I'm one of those, when it talks about the idea of one beggar showing another beggar how to find bread, that's kind of how this is going to play out, because I'm still struggling with this and trying to figure this out in my life. But I looked in this particular passage in the book of Mark, and I found some interesting things. First of all, I want to read this quote from a woman named Rochella Parham. She did a little bit on the idea of rest, and she said, "At its heart, the spiritual practice of rest is an act of trust, a statement of confidence in God and His provision for us." That just burned at me as someone who struggles and fails mightily with the idea of rest. If that's true, that spiritual practice of rest is an act of trust and statement of confidence in God, what does that say about my level of faith in God? So I want to give you a little bit of audience participation time. If I were to have you answer the question, what is the biggest obstacle in your life to rest? Could you give me, anybody at all, give me a one-word answer to that? What's the biggest obstacle to rest in your life? Yes? Your mind? Yes? Guilt. Hold that one. Yes? Anxiety? Okay. Anita. That's funny. Yes. FOMO. Okay. Yep. Yep. Yes, absolutely. Netflix. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Binge watching is not necessarily rest. We try to play that off as rest, but that's not necessarily rest. Anyone else? Those are great. Oh, Anita.
I put it in one word, but the needs of the world.
Okay, needs.
So much to do.
Yeah, okay. That's a good one. Okay, those are all really good. I want to think about this for a moment. What I came up with for mine, my biggest thing is, and this probably, I don't know if this plays into my pastoral role and my struggle with this, but mine would be guilt. Absolutely. All of the other ones that you added all would factor into it too. Everyone except Anita. Anita's. I have a great relationship with Anita, so I don't. But I would say guilt is probably one of those. Now in Exodus, you may remember that it says, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work," unless you're a pastor. That's true. My wife says technically the seventh day is Saturday, but we've changed that. In the book of Genesis, At the end of this, it says, "And God saw all he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day." And then we know, if we carry that out, then it says, "Then on the seventh day, God rested." So I have this thought that goes rolling around in my head. It occurred to me that God rested when he was done, and he saw that it was good. Maybe that's why it's so difficult for me to rest, because I never feel like I'm done. And I oftentimes never feel like I'm good enough. I wonder if there's something in there, there's some biblical wisdom or model that God did all of this stuff for, Genesis says 6 days, whether you believe it was 6 literal days or 6 figurative days or whatever, that's the idea is that God created all of this, he did all of this, he got to the end, he looked at it, he said, "Yep, it's done, it's good, I'm hanging out." He's tired. Maybe I have a difficult time resting because I never think that I'm done. And I never think that I'm good enough. There's always one more thing. Now, if you knew me, and people that have known me throughout my life in ministry, one of the biggest jokes within leadership in the churches and the ministries I've been a part of is when I'm ignorant enough to say, "Hey, you know what? This looks good. Let's just leave it alone, and we're just going to go with that for the next year." And there'll be silence for like 2 seconds, and then someone will start giggling, and they'll all start laughing. "Oh, yeah, right." Because they know by next week, I'm already trying to figure out how to improve whatever it was that we were just getting involved in. Because I just am relentless on trying to figure out how to do it better. Probably it made me a good engineer when I was in my pre-pastor days. When I was an engineer, I was always trying to figure out how to do it better. When I got into ministry, I was always trying to figure out how to do it better. In my own personal life, I'm always trying to figure out how to do it better. But guess what happens when you're always assuming you can do something better? You're always assuming that you're not good enough in the first place. And so all of those things began to resonate within me, and then I began to curse Andrew for suggesting that I study up and talk to you about rest. And so as I got further into this and began to try and figure this out and say, okay, I have all this stuff, I understand, I have a counselor, I can talk about him with the psychological aspect of it later on, but to try and figure this out in my own life, in my spiritual life, that one particular phrase that Rochelle had about the idea that your ability to rest is kind of contingent on basically your faith in God and how God's got a handle on the world. And so that really sank in, because I like to think that I have total faith in God and all he's done and what he is doing now and all he'll continue to do. But obviously, maybe I don't. Maybe it's more of a faith issue with me. So as I was wrestling with this and got into this, I wandered into Mark chapter 4. And I started to reread this again when the story of an evening when Jesus and his closest followers set out across the Sea of Galilee by boat. Jesus understood how to rest. Jesus understood when you needed to step away and be by yourself. And in this particular instance, he was stepping away from this scenario, and he was bringing some of his closest inner circle with him, and they were going across the water to get away. It says, on that day when evening came, he said to them, "Let's go over to the other side." After dismissing the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. Now, tired from his endeavors, tired from all of this stuff, as they're manning the boats, and Jesus is thinking, well, they're the experts with the boats, I'm just going to lay down and I'm going to go to sleep. And a heavy storm arises, and his friends are filled with fear, and in their frightened state, they begin to question Jesus. It says, and a fierce gale of wind developed, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling with water. And yet Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Wow, I would love to be in that place. I would love to be in the place in my life where, regardless of what was going on around me, and all hell's breaking loose, and the storms are raging, I'm like, you know what, that couch looks good. I'm going to curl up over there and just let it go. So he's asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? So I'm going to let us answer that question for a moment for Jesus. So they wake him up and they say, Jesus, do you not care that we are perishing? What would your response be if you were Jesus? Okay. Leave me alone, I'm sleeping. Don't fear. Have faith. Trust. They're looking at this like, yeah, that's easy for you to say, but this is our life. We live on these boats. We understand these storms. We know what our boats can take. So Jesus is just, it's interesting that he doesn't, at least in the account here, he doesn't even acknowledge their question. Like, he doesn't even acknowledge the question. Now here's my thinking, though. If you go back to what Rochella said, and don't reverse it and say Rochella is the teacher and Jesus is the student, I think she's drawing out of this. What Rochella said is your ability to rest and relax and be at peace is directly related to your confidence in God that He has you. Because Jesus doesn't even give them a response. It says he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, hush, be still. And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. Another translation of this is peace, be still. Now he doesn't even acknowledge them. He's laying there, he's sleeping. I remember this brought up a time in our lives for Joni and I, and this is sometimes how we interact. And if I get woken up, I can sometimes be irrational, because I'm somebody, like, I don't need a ton of sleep, but when my body says it's time to go to sleep, there is almost nothing you can do to prevent that. I could sleep standing up. And, you know, when you get into healthy marriage relationships, how many have either lived by or have heard, oh, never go to sleep angry? I'm sorry, I'm going to sleep. Some of our earliest marital, and Joni's one of those, no, we're not going to sleep until we have this solved. And so literally we've had at least one occasion that I can remember when I just kept turning over, and she'd go to the other side of the bed and go, we're not done. And I'm like, I'm done. I'm turning over the other way. So I'm somebody that when I'm asleep, I'm asleep, and I can be irrational at times. And there was a time, we lived in the Midwest. I'd gone back to Bible college. We lived in the middle of Illinois, central Illinois, and it's all cornfields there. And in the fall, when the harvest comes through and the combines come through, the mice come out of the fields in waves, and they go anywhere they can possibly go. And it was fall, and I was not feeling well, and I was laying on the couch, like dozing off, trying to sleep, and I hear a scream come out of the kitchen, and a mouse had gotten into our kitchen, and the scream was from Joni, and apparently, so I trying to figure out what went on, she's telling me that the mouse had run across the counter and had gone into the stove, like down into the oven. Well, it ran across her hand, she's clarifying, it ran across her hand, hence the scream, but he ran down into the oven, okay? I told you I can be irrational when I'm waking up. I didn't even address that or her screaming or any of that stuff, I walked over to our oven and I hit clean function and it locked it down. And you know what happens in a self-cleaning oven. And I went back on the couch. And I was there only, I don't know how long, not very long, and all of a sudden something in my brain was like, snap out of it. That was probably not a good idea. Well, by that time, there's nothing you can do. Fortunately, for those of you who are animal advocates, no mice were harmed in this scenario because he had gotten out somewhere else and taken off before I locked it down. So, there was all kinds of reasons to rejoice in that. But that's how I can be when I'm woken up and I'm thinking of Jesus asleep on the stern, like if the storms didn't wake him up, like these guys shaking him, and he doesn't even address them. He just goes straight to the source and says to the elements, peace, be still, and it was.
To be fair to the Jesus followers,
okay,
they didn't really know that he was God yet, right?
That's true. I am not criticizing the fear of the fishermen.
They were on the ocean,
Yes.
the sea. They knew what that could do.
You're right. So totally justified, going crazy. Jesus isn't going crazy because he understood that God was in control. He understood that he had the ability to just say, okay, enough, we're done. Nobody's going to sink here tonight. So I thought about that.
He was also probably thinking, I've got a lot of work to do with these guys.
Yes, he was probably thinking, I got a lot of work to do with these people. And that's true, and he has a lot of work to do with all of us, too, in that vein. And so I was thinking about that and wondering, okay, how does that translate? Like, how can we get something concretely and figure this out? Because I can tell you all I want to that I'm terrible at this and make excuses and just say, this is just too difficult for me to be able to handle. But I need to grow up. I'm old enough. I need to just begin to do something constructive with this and figure this out and figure it out better. And so I came up with just kind of this kind of framework that I use to deal with some other areas in my life, spiritual life. And so I went through these steps that we're going to go through really quickly. So trying to get us, because if you're somebody in here who has rest, like you just got that nailed, I've got a well-balanced life, and I'm just cruising on that, then that's wonderful. I want to meet you, but that's really wonderful, and take this for what it's worth. This is kind of a practical thing that we do. And so when we get into that, the first thing is assess. So you have to stop and take inventory of your life. What is it that's keeping you from just being able to relax and let God happen? So for some of us, the things that are just, if we're going to be honest, how about carrying around your phone in your hand and just wandering around with your phone, scrolling? That's like, you can't rest like that. I'm in this weird space where I'm in technology and I use it well, but I hate it at the same time. It drains me. I can only be on a computer or on my phone or whatever for a certain period of time, and then I get very agitated. And so I know if I assess my life, that's something that's not helping me. It could be something like, you are somebody who I know when we had kids and now my kids have kids, I look at their lives and their kids are in everything, constantly, everything. So they could be gone, they're in school all day and then they're gone somewhere in the evening and and the parents are both working, and you go and you talk to someone like that about rest, and they're just like, I don't even have any idea what you're talking about. So that's honestly where some of us are. Some of us are probably honestly workaholics. I have to look at that in my particular place in life. Am I that? So that's what I mean by assess. Take a good hard look in the mirror and say, what is it that is really keeping me from being able to just rest and relax, especially in my faith. So once you have that down, you need to try and figure out a way to disconnect from some of those things. And I'm not saying okay, I'm never going to go on social media again ever. That's not going to happen. That's just self-defeating. But I can say I have a friend who's in ministry, and he will only look at his email for like the first 15 minutes of his day, and for 15 minutes in the last segment of his day, not just before he goes to bed, but in the last. And he's a very well-known person, and he does a lot of stuff with a lot of people all across the world, and it frustrates everyone else. His name's Dan, also, ironically, but it frustrates everyone else who is trying to live this ministry life, that they can't get through to this guy who has established boundaries in his life, because that's what he needs to have some version of rest. I just think that's weirdly funny. So you can't get a hold of him. He won't respond to texts, because that he just has blocked out. That was a thing for him. So to be able to disconnect from that, if you're somebody who's obsessed with like binge watching, and I don't know, one of the things you could practically do is go from 5 streaming services that you subscribe to 2. That would cut out some of your binge watching capability. So there's some of those kind of practical, not necessarily monumental things. So find a way to disconnect from the things that are keeping you from being able to rest. And the next one is to be able to connect, but that's connect when you get rid of some of those things. Somebody said early on, like when I talked about obstacle to rest, there's this like the ability, like your mind keeps going, all of those kind of things. So my wife and I have this thing. She started it based on I don't know if any of you ever watched Gilmore Girls back in time, and Lorelai talked about what happens when she like is by herself and she's within her own thoughts, like she's trying to like be at peace and do all this stuff, and like almost immediately it's like monkey underpants in her head. So that's what Joni and I, every time we try to just sit with our own thoughts, I curse this instantly. I start like monkey underpants in my head. Like your thoughts can't turn off. So that can, if you just disconnect from other stuff, you're going to be dealing with everything that's going on in your brain. So you have to, the idea of this is to disconnect from that, but connect with something else. Whether it's reading something in scripture, whether it's reading an inspirational book, whether it's just being able to take a walk. And just being able to take a walk, that's about the only time I can disconnect entirely. So find a way to connect with something that's positive and draws you in and focuses you on what God's doing in your life and what God's done in your life. That first song that we sang this morning, talking about faithful for what God has done, and so I know He's going to be faithful to continue on. So, but you have to connect with those parts. So restore is then, how do I restore balance in that? Because I'm not going to get rid of everything that's a distraction. But how do I restore balance? So I have some healthy boundaries, and I'm able to establish some healthy rhythms, especially. The rhythm piece is hard. But then at the end of the list is the idea of repetition, to repeat that. It was interesting when I was looking at this, I saw this, there was a study done not all that long ago in the UK about how babies learn to rest and how they learn, and they studied them as as they were growing up, and they discovered that babies learn to rest the same way that they learn to walk, in the same way that they learn to eat, in the same way that they learn to run. They learn by repetition. They see it modeled, obviously, but then they repeat it, they repeat it, they repeat it. And so that's the important thing, is to be able to do that. To be able to repeat it, to be able to do it over and over and over again. Now, Rochelle had one more thing that she said, and this is important, I think, as we wrap this up. She said, I think we often fail to consider that we must choose to rest, or else we're likely to have rest forced upon us when we are exhausted to the point of physical, mental, or emotional distress. So we get to choose to rest ahead of time, or eventually rest is going to be forced upon us. We are not going to have any choice. Our bodies, our minds, our spirits are not going to be able to endure this. And some people can, just like anything else, some people have a tolerance and an endurance factor that they can go forever and ever and ever, but at some point there's going to be a cutoff point. And so it's really important for us to be able to decide that we are going to choose to do that at the time. One of the things that in Psalm 46, there's a verse that says, 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." And I keyed in on that as I was doing that this week, because there's a spiritual practice that I do. It's called a breath prayer, and you can do it with different scriptures. I do it with this particular verse, "Be still and know that I am God." And the way that I do it is I take it, I inhale deeply, and I exhale, and I say, "Be still and know that I am God." And then I inhale deeply, and then I say, "Be still and know that I am." And then I inhale, and then while I'm exhaling, I say, "Be still and know," and I go all the way down to that until it's just be. And then I start over again. And that, if I'm in a panic situation, or I'm in a place, sometimes I've woken up at night and my head's just going crazy, and I got things in my mind, and I'm either panicky or anxious or just restless. I will key in on this, and I will do it in the middle of the night, and I will do it 2 times, 4 times, sometimes 24 times before I just am like, okay, I got a handle on this. It was interesting as I looked at that verse again, and I looked at it in a couple of different translations, and I haven't done this before. It's also translated as, "Stop striving and know that I am God." And I was like, oh, I get it. That's my whole nature. That's all of our natures, is that we're striving for something. We're struggling for something. We're trying to do better, bigger, faster, longer, whatever. We are striving for it. And when God's saying, "Be still," He's also saying, stop striving. Just relax. Just rest. I honestly don't know how well. I shouldn't say how well. I'm not going to give up on this. I can't give up on it. And eventually, when my time is up, I will have forced rest anyway. But I don't know how quickly this is going to go. But I do know that it is all contingent on, for me, it's contingent on me just being able to take my hands off the wheel, stop pushing, stop striving, just be still and know that he is God. So I'm going to ask you to pray with me and pray for peace. Father, we're just grateful for the way that peace is modeled for us. And we are sometimes, actually a lot of the time, just like the guys in the boat, and we don't understand, we're restless, we're worried, we're trying to figure out things on our own power and on our own understanding, and help us in those moments to just be at peace and to remember that you are God and we get to rest in you. And it's through your Son's name we pray. Amen.